Heidi Sutton Turner, COO of Vanderbloemen, and we're talking about housing allowances today. And I brought in Jeff Robinson. Jeff is with Guidestone. He's Director of Personal Financial Services. And if you guys don't know who Guidestone is, it's one of the largest financial companies that serves churches, has an amazing history. But Jeff, welcome and thank you for your time and thank you for your heart to help pastors.
Well, thank you, Sutton. Appreciate it very much for you allowing me to be on with you today. And just very briefly about Guidestone, as Sutton mentioned, we were founded 102 years ago by the Southern Baptist Convention. We are a not-for-profit. We're a little bit unique in that sense in the financial services world. And originally founded as a welfare benefit arm of the Southern Baptist Convention. We have gradually expanded those services over the years, and we also expanded who we serve. I guess about 12 years ago or so, 12, 14 years ago, we expanded those that we can serve beyond the Southern Baptist world. We can serve like-minded evangelical churches and institutions. And
Great.
so some of you that may be listening, we very well may serve also. But
yeah, we serve about 50 denominations.
Yeah.
And so I would think that most denominations, as I've had more and more relationship with people at Guidestone, we pretty much cross over probably 80%. So I think most people that are listening today, that they need to listen up, and Guidestone might be able to help them or their specific church.
Well, at our heart, it's the pastor at the crossroads. That's who's at our heart that we serve. You know, that was our original foundation and ministry there, and we just expanded that over time. So, look forward to visiting with them today.
So, Jeff, give me a little background on yourself, how long you've been at Guidestone, what you've done in the past to kind of bring the person that's listening to say, you know what, Jeff's pretty much an expert in this area.
Yep, I've served with Guidestone for 18 years now. My current role, I'm director of the Personal Financial Services team at Guidestone. We work directly with the pastors, looking at their retirement needs and retirement planning needs. And we look at things as how they have their retirement plans allocated down to fund specific advice. Look at, are they saving enough? What does it look like on a decumulation, a payout basis? How well prepared are they? And so prior to this role that I'm serving in now, I served in a relationship management role where I actually was responsible for maintaining the relationship between Guidestone and the individual local churches, and we would go out and meet with individual pastors, do group meeting, educational, and help them design effective retirement plans for their individual churches.
That's great. Well, Jeff, thanks for serving all these churches this many years, and so
Yes.
we really appreciate your heart and your company's heart. Let's dive into what I call the greatest benefit that a pastor can participate in, which is the housing allowance. And if we can you kind of break it down from a high level point of view, what a housing allowance actually is?
Yes, and the housing allowance has existed in the tax code literally for decades. And one thing, if they don't take anything else away today, Scott, of Sutton from the presentation, is housing allowance. Most pastors think about it while they're earning a salary and they're on staff, but it also is very beneficial in the retirement years. You actually can claim housing allowance against the distributions from a denominational sponsored plan like a Guidestone retirement plan there. But in a nutshell, housing allowance is the ability for the pastor to be able to exclude, if you will, from federal income tax expenses associated with housing. And so the big ones we think of, Sutton, of course, are mortgage and interest, utilities, homeowners insurance, things like maintaining, like landscaping, home improvement. So it's those big ticket items associated with home ownership in a nutshell.
You know, Jeff, we do a ton of compensation analysis for churches all the time. And one of the questions I get a lot is housing allowance included, or is housing allowance put on top of? And most people don't, when they ask me that question, it indicates to me that they don't truly understand housing allowance. Housing allowance is just taking your salary, your gross salary, and how much of those dollars based upon your housing expenses do you get to claim that's non-taxable. And so you and I might be a lead pastor at one church, and you might be a lead pastor at another church, might be the exact same size and attendance size of budget and attendance. And let's say that we're paid exactly the same. However, you've got 4 kids in a big house, and I have a small apartment that I live all by myself. And it's an old apartment. I don't spend a whole lot on my rental expenses. The difference in our 2 housing allowance is quite large, but it doesn't mean that our salary changes at all. It just means you're able to deduct or claim more of your salary tax-free than I am.
That's right. That's exactly right. A big part of it, Sutton, is going to vary by geographic location. For instance, a pastor serving out in California is likely going to have a much larger housing allowance than, say, somebody serving in Waco, Texas. Just
right.
Living associated in those different geographic areas. So to your point exactly there.
Right. And to so let's kind of dive into the process of claiming a housing allowance. So
yes.
So a pastor goes to their church and requests a housing allowance. What does that request look like? What does it need to be documented? Can it be verbal? What's the interaction? Because from my understanding, this doesn't cost the church anything as far as the costs that they're outlaying, as far as to be able to provide a housing allowance. It's just basically permission. So what kind of interaction does the church have with the pastor in this housing allowance to grant them a housing allowance?
You're exactly right. It doesn't cost the church anything, but it is very key that it's done the right way, so that if the church or the pastor are audited, that everything's documented. So this typically starts, before you go, as you're going into the budget year for the church, that the church would give the pastor an inventory of housing expenses. And so ideally, the pastor would complete this. That's what we see with most, especially the medium to larger size churches we see. They'll have some form that's basically an inventory for the pastor to say, well, this is how much I have in mortgage and interest. This is how much my utility bills will be. This is what the maintenance will be. This is what my homeowner's insurance. So they'll go through this grocery list, and they'll document what they can justify as housing. Then the budget committee or personnel committee, the deacons, whoever the governing body is of the local church, ideally they will provide the pastor a notification of housing allowance. And we have a sample one of these in our compensation planning guide that's free for anybody that they can go to our website and search that compensation planning guide. We have a model one of these, but it's a resolution, if you will, where the governing body of the church says we've approved this housing allowance for Pastor Sutton this year. And so that's on record. The pastor gets a copy of that. Now, ideally, as a backstop, if you will, the church on that notification of housing allowance form, they will put that it applies to this year, so for 2020, and all years following unless updated. Okay. And that's what we call an evergreen provision. So if the church accidentally forgets to do it in 2021, well, they can use the same number for 2020. And so that it's good to have that evergreen in there, because you can only designate housing prospectively. So okay. I'll give you a very quick example.
Because I think that's a real important concept. So we're recording this in September of 2020. So if you and I were meeting today and we were looking at my housing allowance, talk to me about what time period we're talking about.
Exactly. So let's say that we sit down and I'm bringing you on, I'm the executive pastor at Church XYZ, and we're bringing Sutton on as our minister, our worship pastor, effective October 1. And so we would, as a part of the onboarding process, we would give him that list where he could inventory what his housing expenses were going to be. And then we could declare that housing allowance for Sutton from October 1 through 12/31.
Okay.
And so in that case, we would have done it for just those last 3 months, the fourth quarter of 2021. We would definitely want to redo the form for you for 2021 because we just did it for the fourth quarter of 2020 for you in that instance. What we can't do is we cannot go back and look retroactively to what you did the first 9 months of the year.
Okay.
You would have to do that with your prior church or prior ministry there. That's where you can get a lot of trouble if you try to go retroactive. Housing must always be prospective, always prospective.
So today, September of 2020, can I go ahead and petition the board for what I think my housing allowance is going to be for 2021?
I mean, you could. You could itemize that out, and they could say, but you couldn't consider those expenses past 2020.
Okay.
So the housing
Right.
applies year by year. In other
Right. But
words,
for an approval for next year, as long as I'm still employed, obviously by the church,
yeah.
that would be
Yeah, there's no reason that you couldn't do that. We just
okay.
know that because remember, and we'll probably get to this in a second. But what is housing that you can what's the limit that you can claim? Remember, it's the lesser of three things.
Right.
It's the lesser of what the church or the ministry declares for the pastor,
Right.
or their actual expenses. So that's why I'll stress it's very important, Sutton, for people to keep records. It is important to save receipts and the copies of their bills for their utilities and homeowners and property taxes and things like that. And then the last thing is the fair market rental value of a fully furnished home in your area. And so I have to stress it's the lesser of those three things. And so if you're audited, the IRS is likely going to look at, well, what's the fair market rental value? And how they could determine that, or what I encourage people to do is get a local real estate agent, a realtor that's a member of the church, have them run a comparable, uh, uh, a comp to the home you live in your area for a fully furnished home. And
Right.
just keep that in your tax file in case
Right.
it's nothing you have to submit to anybody, but you'll have that or you can go to Zillow or places like that, and you can see, well, what's a fully furnished home in my area renting for?
Okay.
And then if you're audited and they come back with some real low number, you can say, well, no, back when I claimed that housing, here's what homes were renting for in my area.
Okay. All right. So let's just say in that situation, I'm living in a apartment, single guy, and I decide to get married. And by the way, I'm getting married to a lady that has a family. So I'm immediately, well, I'm going to need a 4-bedroom house in
Yeah.
2020. So do I need to just some do I need to come back to that housing committee and say, hey, I need to increase my housing allowance before I move into those additional expenses? Do I need to get approval to increase that housing allowance before I actually incur those expenses?
It could be a part of the same process, Sutton, I would say, but definitely that would be a change in your situation like that would be a reason to come back to the committee, your HR office, whatever your situation is, and say, hey, I need to increase my housing allowance from this point forward. Now, one thing, remember though, what governs the housing allowance? It's the lesser of those three things.
Right.
So we'll have people ask, well, if I put a big down payment this year on the house, or if I'm going to take out a home improvement loan, can I write off claim that whole improvement loan as housing? Remember, it's the lesser of three things. And so
Right.
if the fair market rental value is below what taking out the home improvement loan or the home equity loan to improve your house would be, then no, you can't claim that full home equity loan. And please, please don't fall into this trap. We've seen this before. You can't take a home equity loan out to send your kids to college and claim it as
Right,
housing. It's got to be
right,
related to the house.
right. Okay, so talk to me about, so we've got the mortgage or the rental amount. So the big amount, we understand that is a
Mhm.
big component of housing allowance. But what about maintenance costs?
Yeah.
What can I include? What's not included?
So, if you have your yard done, if you have to have the house painted, plumbing, electrical, home improvement like that, all of that can be included.
Right.
You obviously, can include your telephone there. Phones, that's a gray area. They've never come down on the IRS and said you could claim cell phones as housing or not. They
Right.
talk about in terms of what the cost of a telephone in your area. So that's one. Uh, so I'd be
How about
careful
how
there.
about internet? How about internet expense?
I think you're good there because that's such a basic.
Pest pest control.
Yes. Now, what's ironic, you can pay to maintain the outside of the house, the landscaping, everything, but not have a housekeeper come once a week or every other week to clean the inside. That
Okay.
you can't claim that. But supplies, cleaning supplies like your paper towels and things like that, that you have to maintain the house yourself, you can. So it gets down that
Okay.
basic. So.
So okay, so let's. So I think you've done a great job on articulating how I get the housing allowance. I think you've done a great job on saying like, okay, what can I include? So at years down the line, what kind of records do I need to keep, and whose responsibility is it? Is it the church that approved my housing allowance, or do I have to keep the records?
I would say both. And generally speaking, you want to keep at least 7 years of records in
Okay.
arrears.
Yes,
Because
sir.
generally speaking, on an audit, they won't go back past 7 years. But you want to keep about 7 years worth of records. But the church and the minister should have a record of where that housing was designated. And so you want to keep good records because, again, uh, if you're audited, they're going to look at the lesser of those three things. And so, ideally, typically, the number that the church designates for you will be the largest number.
Yes, sir.
And then a lot of time, your expenses may be more than the fair market rental value. It just
Right.
depends. But what's the ramifications, Sutton? If I
That's what I was
designate,
just about to ask you.
well, yeah, if somebody, let's say the church declares 24,000 for you, and you only actually spend 20. Well, they just include the extra 4,000 as you said at the very first. That's your gross salary. So instead of 24 coming off for federal income tax purposes, it'll only be 20. So that extra four you would pay federal income taxes on.
Right. Right.
Now,
Right.
I should point this out because there's a distinction between Social Security taxes and federal income taxes. There is a difference. And so housing is not excluded from Social Security. SECA taxes for ministers, because
Right.
ministers have a dual tax status. They're employees, W-2 employees of the church, but they're self-employed for Social Security purposes.
Correct.
So most ministers, if they didn't opt out of Social Security, they know about SECA, the self-employment taxes, because that 15.3% that they pay. So keep in mind that housing allowance does not lower the amount subject to SECA tax. We're solely focused on lowering federal income tax when we're talking
Right.
about a housing allowance.
Okay. So what happens in to someone that doesn't, that's audited?
Mm-hmm.
What's the worst case scenario? So I'm approved for 24,000. I take 35,000, or I don't keep any records and I still keep the housing allowance at a high level, etc. So I don't do what you and I just told everybody to do. So what's the fear that we need to put? Good fear, a fear that we need to put in these pastors as far as you need to do this if you're going to take a housing allowance.
Yeah, the worst case, they would, if they came in and you claim 35, and they came in and said, well, fair market rental value is 24, so you're off by $11,000. They would be looking for federal income tax on that extra $11,000 plus penalty and interest, as
So
worst
plus
case scenario.
penalty and interest. And so if I'm a pastor of this church for 25 years and this has kind of been an ongoing, we never
Yeah.
really kept records and everything like that, this could be a big problem
Yeah,
financially for the pastor.
yeah, if they get into a real detailed audit like that, and they start digging in there, like I say, they generally won't go back more than 7 years unless they are suspect fraud, and there's actually no limit to how far back, they can go on, if they're looking for a fraud type case. Those are rare. That'd be very
Right,
rare. But
right,
from a practical standpoint, you're looking at potential penalty and interest and the back taxes.
right.
Back taxes plus penalty and interest
That's
is
good.
is which is not a cheap
No,
alternative.
absolutely.
It's not a good situation. And Sutton, we should point out that that not all of the church staff can claim housing. We've been speaking under the assumption you must be considered a minister to be eligible for housing, and that's determined by the local church. But I can give them some
Yeah,
guidelines on.
there's some duties that they're supposed to perform, correct?
Yes, and so we refer to those as sacerdotal duties.
Hmm.
That's from the same root word as the sacraments or
Sacraments.
sacraments, and basically, the 5 questions will help determine if a person is a minister for federal tax purposes. And so, one of the big ones is the person ordained, licensed, or commissioned? And does that individual administer the ordinances like baptism and the Lord's Supper? Does this individual conduct religious worship services on a regular basis? Or do they have a position of management responsibilities within the church? And are they considered to be a religious leader by that church body? And so, if the more of those you can answer yes to, the more it's likely that, yeah, the IRS would agree this person's a minister.
Right,
That they're very deferential typically to the local church because they don't want to get into a church state issue. But
right,
it's nice that you can say the more of those you can say yes to, and certainly being licensed, appointed, or ordained. But at the end of the day, the local church body determines who is serving in a ministerial capacity.
right.
So I have seen situations where you have a licensed or ordained individual, but they're not considered ministerial at that local church body because of the particular position they're serving in.
Right. That's good.
Yeah.
So any final thoughts for pastors out there, as it relates directly to housing allowance, way that you at Guidestone can serve them going forward? Any other thoughts in that area?
Yeah, just a couple of final thoughts on that, Sutton, is remember the housing allowance is not just for the working years alone. It's very powerful from a tax planning standpoint to know that you can claim housing against the church retirement plan coming out, because that means, you lowered your salary in all likelihood with contributions that you deducted from your salary when you put contributions into a retirement plan. Those contributions grew and accumulated, and so they were tax deferred. And it's not uncommon that when individual ministers are drawing out their retirement benefit from us or another denominational pension board, that they can claim up to 100% housing against that when that benefit is being drawn. So it's possible it may escape income taxation completely there.
Now, let me ask you a
So
question, clarification on there. Let's just say that I'm a
sure.
lead pastor of a local church for until I'm 65. I retire at age 65, and I no longer serve in a local church body, participate in sacerdotal duties. Can I still, in retirement, take that housing allowance?
That's what I'm saying. And
Okay.
so where Guidestone steps in, how the local church body declared the housing for you?
Yes, sir.
Now, Guidestone takes that place and the minister self-declares to us on the form we have them fill out. They tell us what portion of their distribution will be housing. So now it's the lesser of your actual expenses or fair market rental value. What the church
Right.
declares for you, that goes away, in
Correct.
retirement. So yeah,
That's
we
great.
we step in there, and the minister will self-certify that. You still need to keep your records,
Right.
even in retirement. So that I would stress to the ministers listening that how important it is to know that housing is, you can also use it in retirement. Very powerful. Now you cannot claim housing on an IRA.
Right.
It has to be coming from a church retirement plan like a 403b9 or a 403b7,
Right.
sponsored by the local church or a denominational pension body like Guidestone.
That's good. That's
And
good. Well,
the other thing I would mention, Sutton,
yes, sir.
we have a ministerial tax issues, about a 25-page brochure. Again, it's free. You can go to our website and type in ministerial tax issues in the search field, and it'll come right up. There's no login ID or anything to get to it, but it's the ministerial tax issues.
So when we post this video, Jeff, I'll put all of those links below, and so that people can easily find that information, and also some of those, for example, the 5 questions that you were talking about. We'll
Yeah, that's
make
in the
sure that
guide.
those are.
That's in the
Yep.
guide. It sure is.
Yep.
And then that compensation planning guide I mentioned, that's also
Yes, sir.
free. It's designed for, personnel or budget committees. We designed it with them in mind to properly design the comprehensive plan for their ministers.
That's great. Well, Jeff, I really appreciate you joining us today, you clarifying the biggest benefit for pastors and churches, that they can participate, that doesn't cost their church any dollars.
Right.
I thank you for you and Guidestone serving pastors and churches for so many years, and appreciate your service and love for Jesus and his church.
Happy to do it. God
Yes,
bless you
sir.
all.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Bye-bye.